So as Elsa introduced, I am a philosopher by training. I decided to focus on more applied issues of philosophy, so looking at how philosophy can speak into real-life issues and real-life questions. In particular, I'm focused on issues of childhood, of children's freedom and children's rights. And I think similar to what Kieran mentioned of trying to see children and youth not as spectators, but are actors in life. We try in the Center of Children's Rights in Belfast to do the same, but from the perspective of research. Right? So the work that we do aims to go beyond merely studying children by including children and youth throughout the whole research process. We set the research objectives and priorities in tandem with an advisory group of children and youths. We analyze the data together with them, and we jointly discuss the results and the dissemination process. So the core, as I mentioned, the core focus of my research has been on looking at exploring what children are, how we perceive children in society, and how does this impact on the rights that they have and the rights that they claim. A couple of the projects I'm working currently, which are relevant to this issue, we did a large-scale survey on the impact of the COVID 2020 lockdowns on children's rights protection. We've surveyed around 30,000 children and youth across the globe on questions of health, education, security, play, participation, etc. And the idea was not only to ask children how they felt, but also explore the data with the children themselves. Besides this, the central project I'm currently working on looks at the theory and implementation of children's rights, particularly with children themselves, and focused on marginal cases of childhood. So for example, children who live on the streets, child workers, child migrants. And the idea is not only to explore what these issues are, again, just as with the COVID project, but explore it with the children themselves. So it's not only to look at what should child workers be, but ask child workers themselves what they think their rights are. And I think that this is the objective, try to balance doing high-level research on the topic of childhood, but by introducing children themselves throughout the whole process.
Yeah, that's it. Can you give us a little overview about the research you've made directly on the COVID-19? What were the main learnings, just to have a big picture in 1 minute?
Yes, so I mean, it was such a large project that we have a lot of things, and I think that we're going to start bringing out a lot of briefs on the topic, but based on the priorities set by our child advisory group, we decided to focus on 3 issues to do our first analysis, particularly education, and how do children themselves feel that their education may have been affected or benefited by the lockdown. I mean, we think that maybe the fact that schools were closed was a bad thing, but for many children, actually studying at home was very beneficial. And I think that this balance is important to explore. And the other 2 topics was they were very concerned with the issue of violence during lockdown. The fact that especially girls suffer from household violence, sexual violence, that there's an increase in online harassment as well. They were very interested, the advisory group was very interested in exploring this topic and finding solutions to this. So these were the 2 main issues that we're currently addressing and looking at. And we're looking forward to sharing the results when they're fully analyzed with the kids themselves.
Yeah.
I think that actually one of the most gratifying features of doing research jointly with children and youth themselves is when you surprise yourself that you realize that you're not the expert that you thought you was. Right? So you can have spent all your life studying children, looking at children, reading all the documents, reading the books, reading the articles, and then a 5-year-old child just comes up with a truth that decades of research on it may not have. You may not have access to that element. And I think you mentioned the question of child workers, and I think that personally for me this has been one of the most surprising issues to deal with. Because as you mentioned, when we arrive to experts to analyze particularly issues that affect children from more vulnerable areas that have a different life world, a different conception of the world, that they live in a different reality, we arrive from certain misconceptions. Sometimes the fact of coming from the global north may affect the way that researchers study, for example, working children in Latin America. But and our economic conditions also affected, but I think that as a core issue, especially when doing research on childhood, is that we have very strong limitations by the fact of being adults. We have a certain form of understanding what the world is, what the world should be, what children should be, what their best interests are, and this limits a lot the scope of opportunities that we have available when thinking about solutions to children's problems, especially very vulnerable children.
Would you say, Nicolas, that we forgot that we were kids once?
Well, so I think there's a part that is this, that I think that there's certain interests that, and I think that this reflects what Samson mentioned before. There's a matter of urgency, and I don't think it's only because of the fact that if we wait for children to grow up, let's say the planet will have already passed the deadline of making change, but also because there's a particularity in being a child, in the way they see the world and that they see themselves, that allows them to see them from a different perspective. But I think that beyond, I think I agree that the fact that we've forgotten that we were children is an important element, but there's the other, that there's certain realities that we don't have access to directly, and we have only had access to it through books or through indirect research. So in the case of children workers, we as researchers, we always try to think of it as how we in our, let's say, in our comfortable world would deal with this problem, how we see our own children safe in schools and protected by parents and without very harsh poverty issues. But when we ask children workers who live in more dire conditions themselves, they just simply see the alternative of, okay, you could live in a perfect world where you don't have to work. They don't understand, and they don't believe that that's even possible. The reality in which they live forces them to work. They don't do it because they're happy about it. They do it because they're certain that the family needs their support, and the solutions that they themselves propose. For example, the child worker unions in Latin America are very adamant about this, is that they don't want child work to be banned, but what they want is their status as workers to be recognized and their rights as children to be fully fulfilled, so that they're not exploited, so that they're not harmed by the fact that they have to work. So their concern is with the socioeconomic conditions that affect their status, rather than with the fact of working or not. And I think that this is particularly shocking because we tend to think, no, what we should do is ban work for children. Children should be at schools. But when you ask child workers themselves, they may provide you with a different way of understanding of it. Why? Because they've lived it. They live every day the condition of children who have to work, who may not have the best educational opportunities, who suffer under very harsh conditions. And listening to their own epistemic standpoint and allow us to think of alternative ways of fixing the problem, of thinking it from their perspective, standing on their shoes, and asking questions that are relevant to the persons themselves that are being affected by these issues and by this lack of protection of rights that we think is relevant to tackle.